The morning sun cast long shadows through Barbara Wilson's kitchen window as she stood at her granite countertop, her wrinkled hands moving with surprising precision. At 72 years old, she had become a familiar face in the peaceful neighborhood of Oakwood Heights, where perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars were common sights. Today, however, the respected retired schoolteacher wasn't preparing her usual morning tea or organizing her weekly bridge club materials. Instead, Barbara's trembling fingers carefully measured out white powder onto small squares of plastic wrap. Her reading glasses sat perched on the edge of her nose as she worked with the focus of someone completing a delicate craft project. The kitchen, with its spotless surfaces and collection of ceramic roosters, seemed an unlikely place for such activity. Just a little more, she mumbled to herself, measuring the powder with the same attention to detail she had once used to grade papers during her 35 years of teaching at Oakwood Elementary School. Her weathered hands, adorned with a golden wedding ring she still wore 5 years after her husband's passing, moved steadily despite their slight shake. The grandfather clock in her living room struck 9, its deep chimes echoing through the empty house. Barbara glanced up, her steel-gray hair catching the morning light. She had timed this perfectly. The morning rush hour would be ending, but the day shift drivers would still be fresh and eager for fares. She walked to her hall mirror, checking her appearance one final time. Her pearl necklace sat perfectly centered on her cream-colored blouse, and her navy blue skirt fell just below her knees. She looked every bit the respectable widow and retired educator that her neighbors knew her to be. No one would suspect what she carried in her expensive leather handbag. Barbara picked up her landline phone. She still didn't trust those newfangled smartphones, and dialed the local taxi service. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the receiver. "Metropolitan Taxi Services, how can I help you today?" "Yes, dear," Barbara spoke in her best grandmother voice, the one she had used to comfort countless children over her teaching career. "I need a taxi from 1242 Maple Drive in Oakwood Heights. I'm an elderly lady, you see, and I need to get to the shopping center." "Of course, ma'am. We'll have someone there in about 15 minutes. Any preference for the type of car?" Barbara's fingers tightened slightly around the phone. "Oh no, dear. Any driver will do just fine." But she silently hoped they would send exactly the type of driver she was waiting for. While waiting, she went through her mental checklist. The small bags were secured in a hidden pocket of her purse. She had written down the phone number for the anonymous tip line. Her story was prepared in case anyone asked questions later. Everything was in place. From her living room window, Barbara watched the quiet street. Her neighbors were all at work or busy with their daily routines. Mrs. Henderson next door was walking her poodle, and she waved cheerfully at Barbara through the window. Barbara waved back, maintaining her role as the sweet elderly neighbor everyone knew and trusted. The sound of a car approaching made her heart beat faster. Through her lace curtains, she watched as a black and yellow taxi turned onto her street. Barbara took a deep breath, steadying herself. The moment she had planned for was approaching. She watched as the taxi pulled into her driveway. Through the windshield, she could see exactly what she had hoped for, a young black man behind the wheel. Perfect. Her plan could proceed exactly as she had imagined it. Barbara patted her purse, feeling the small lumps where the bags were hidden. She picked up her house keys, though she knew she would be returning home in a different taxi. This driver's day was about to take an unexpected turn, and Barbara felt not even a hint of remorse about what she was about to do. As she walked toward her front door, she rehearsed her gentle smile one more time in the hallway mirror. Years of teaching had made her an excellent actress, and today would require her finest performance yet. The taxi's horn sounded softly outside, a courteous reminder of its presence. "Time to get this done," Barbara whispered to herself, straightening her shoulders and opening her front door. The morning sun felt warm on her face as she stepped outside, every bit the picture of innocence, while carrying out the first step of her sinister plan. Marcus Johnson tapped his fingers on the steering wheel of his taxi as he waited in Barbara Wilson's driveway. He had been driving the morning shift for 6 years now, and it had become a comfortable routine. The dashboard clock showed 9:15 a.m., and he was already thinking about picking up his daughter Jasmine from her after-school basketball practice later that day. At 34, Marcus was younger than most of the veteran taxi drivers at Metropolitan Taxi Services. His dark skin was smooth except for a few laugh lines around his eyes, and he kept his black hair neatly trimmed. His uniform was always clean and pressed, a habit he'd learned from his mother, who had raised him alone while working as a nurse. As he watched the elderly woman approach his taxi, Marcus automatically put on his best professional smile. He had learned early in his career that being extra polite and professional was necessary, especially as a black driver in the upscale neighborhoods. He stepped out of the car to help her. "Good morning, ma'am," Marcus said, opening the back door. "Let me help you with that." He reached for her purse, but Barbara clutched it closer to her chest. "Oh no, dear, I can manage this myself," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But you're very kind to offer." Marcus nodded and waited until she was settled in the back seat before closing her door. As he walked back to the driver's seat, he noticed Mrs. Wilson watching him intently in the rearview mirror. He was used to that kind of attention. Some passengers still weren't comfortable with a black driver. "Where to today, Mrs. Wilson?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice friendly and professional. "The Oakwood Shopping Center, please," she replied, her voice sweet as honey. "And please take Oak Street. I don't like those busy highways." As Marcus drove, his mind wandered to his daughter Jasmine. At 15, she was already talking about college, dreaming of becoming a doctor. Every fare, every tip, every extra shift he worked went into her college fund. He had promised himself that his daughter would have opportunities he never had. "Such a lovely day," Barbara commented from the back seat, interrupting his thoughts. "You must enjoy driving in this weather." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied politely. "It's perfect driving weather." Suddenly, Barbara let out a small gasp. "Oh dear, I dropped my purse. Could you please help me find it when we stop at the next light?" Marcus noticed they were approaching a red light. "Of course, ma'am." He pulled to a stop and turned around to help her search for the purse that had fallen between the seats. While Marcus was distracted with helping her, Barbara's hands moved quickly and purposefully. Her movements were subtle, practiced. Anyone watching from outside would have only seen a kind driver helping an elderly passenger. "Oh, here it is," Barbara exclaimed, holding up her purse. "Thank you so much, young man. You're very helpful." Marcus smiled and returned his attention to driving, unaware of what had just happened. He didn't notice Barbara's hand sliding back into her purse, checking that something was secure. He also didn't notice her other hand slipping her cell phone from her pocket. As they approached the shopping center, Barbara's demeanor changed slightly. She seemed more alert, almost eager. "You can drop me right here at the main entrance," she instructed. Marcus pulled up to the curb and got out to help her. This time, Barbara allowed him to assist her from the car, patting his arm in what appeared to be a grandmotherly gesture. "Thank you, dear," she said, counting out exact change for the fare. "You've been very kind." "Have a good day, Mrs. Wilson," Marcus replied, watching as she walked toward the shopping center entrance. Back in his taxi, Marcus checked the time. The morning was going well, and he had already made enough to add a little extra to Jasmine's college fund. He pulled away from the curb, completely unaware that Barbara Wilson had already stepped into a side alcove, her phone in her hand, dialing a number she had memorized carefully. In just a few minutes, Marcus Johnson's life was about to change forever, and not in the way he had planned when he started his shift that morning. The trap had been set, and he was driving straight into it, thinking only of his daughter's future and the next fare of the day. Barbara Wilson's fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the numbers on her phone. She had stepped into a quiet corner near the shopping center entrance, partially hidden behind a large decorative plant. Her other hand clutched her purse tightly as she waited for someone to answer. "Police department, what's your emergency?" A crisp voice answered. "Yes," Barbara whispered, making her voice sound nervous and frightened. "I need to report something. I just took a taxi, and I saw something terrible." She paused for dramatic effect. "The driver had drugs. I saw them clearly when he was helping me with my purse." The dispatcher's tone became more serious. "Can you describe the taxi and the driver, ma'am?" Barbara described Marcus and his taxi in perfect detail, even providing the taxi number she had memorized. Her acting skills from years of community theater came in handy as she played the role of a scared, concerned citizen. Meanwhile, Marcus was 3 blocks away, picking up his next passenger, a young businessman in a hurry to get to a meeting. Just another normal fare on what seemed like a normal day. He had no idea that police cruisers were already being dispatched to search for his taxi. The first sign that something was wrong came when Marcus noticed a police car in his rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were common in this area. But when a second police car appeared and both turned on their lights, his heart started beating faster. Marcus pulled over carefully, following all the proper procedures he knew. In his rearview mirror, he saw 4 officers approaching his taxi, 2 on each side. His passenger in the back seat looked confused and worried. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them," one officer commanded through a megaphone. Marcus's mind raced. What have he done wrong? He followed every traffic rule, kept his license and registration up to date, and always maintained his taxi perfectly. Still, he knew from experience how to handle police encounters. Slowly, he raised his hands and opened the door. "Officers," he said calmly, "what seems to be the problem?" "Hands on the hood," another officer ordered. Marcus complied, his cheek pressed against the cold metal of his taxi. He could hear his passenger being told to exit the vehicle and move to the sidewalk. The next few minutes felt like hours. The officers searched his taxi thoroughly while holding him against the hood. His thoughts kept going to Jasmine. What if she heard about this? What would she think? What would this do to her reputation at school? "Found something," one officer called out. Marcus's heart nearly stopped. The officer held up a small bag of white powder that had been tucked into the back seat cushion. "That's not mine," Marcus protested, his voice steady despite his rising panic. "I don't know where that came from. I just drive this taxi." But the officers weren't listening. One of them was already reading him his rights while another snapped handcuffs around his wrists. His former passenger stood on the sidewalk, looking shocked and taking out his phone, probably to call for another taxi. As they led him to the police car, Marcus saw a small crowd gathering. Some people were taking videos with their phones. His face burned with shame and anger. He knew he was innocent, but how could he prove it? Inside the police car, Marcus closed his eyes and took deep breaths. He thought about his daughter again, about the college fund he had been building, about all his plans for their future. One false accusation could destroy everything he had worked for. What he didn't know was that Barbara Wilson was still at the shopping center, watching the local news app on her phone with satisfaction. She had done this before, but this time felt different. This time, she was sure she had covered all her tracks. But Barbara had made one crucial mistake. In her careful planning, she had overlooked something important, something that would eventually unravel her entire scheme. As Marcus sat in the back of the police car, a small red light continued to blink steadily on his taxi's dashboard, recording everything that had happened that morning. Detective Sarah Chen sat at her desk, staring at the computer screen with narrowed eyes. Something about this case didn't feel right. On the surface, it looked simple: a taxi driver caught with drugs after a tip from a passenger. But 20 years of police work had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was wrong. She looked through the one-way glass at Marcus Johnson, who sat quietly in the interview room. He didn't fidget or pace like most guilty people did. Instead, he sat straight in his chair, his eyes focused and calm, even after 3 hours of questioning. "Detective Chen, Officer Rodriguez knocked on her door. The taxi company sent over the driver's records you requested." Sarah took the file and started reading. Marcus Johnson had been driving for 6 years. Not a single complaint. Perfect attendance. Multiple letters of appreciation from regular customers. He had even received a community service award for helping an elderly passenger during a medical emergency last year. "Doesn't exactly sound like our typical drug dealer, does it?" Sarah muttered to herself. She picked up the phone and dialed the taxi company again. "This is Detective Chen. One more question. Does the taxi driven by Marcus Johnson have any security cameras?" The answer made her sit up straighter. "A new dashboard camera system? Installed last month? Send me that footage immediately." While waiting for the video, Sarah reviewed the anonymous tip that had started all this. The caller had described the drugs in detail. Too much detail, she realized. Most passengers wouldn't have been able to identify drugs so precisely from a quick glimpse. Her computer pinged with a new email. The video file had arrived. Sarah clicked play and leaned forward, watching carefully. She saw the elderly woman enter the taxi. Everything looked normal until... "Stop right there," Sarah said out loud, rewinding the footage. She watched again in slow motion. The moment when the purse fell, the woman's hand movement. It was subtle, but it was there. Sarah picked up her phone again. This is Detective Chen. I need all reports of drug-related arrests of taxi drivers in the surrounding counties for the past year. Within an hour, her desk was covered with papers. 5 cases, all minority drivers, all arrested after anonymous tips, all involving elderly passengers. The pattern was impossible to ignore. In the interview room, Marcus looked up as Sarah entered, carrying a laptop. "Mr. Johnson," she said, sitting down across from him, "I'd like you to watch something." She played the dashboard camera footage. Marcus's eyes widened as he watched Barbara Wilson's subtle movements. "She planted it," he whispered. "She planted the drugs when I was helping her with her purse." "We believe she's done this before," Sarah explained, spreading out the other case files. "You're not the first driver she's targeted." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the photos of other drivers, all men of color, all with stories similar to his. Outside the interview room, things started moving quickly. Officers were already getting a warrant for Barbara Wilson's address. Computer experts were tracing the anonymous call. The pieces were falling into place. Sarah watched as another officer removed Marcus's handcuffs. His first words were about his daughter. "Can I call Jasmine?" he asked. "She must be so worried." Sarah handed him her phone. "Make your call, Mr. Johnson, and then we'll need your help. Your case might help us free some other innocent drivers." As Marcus called his daughter, Sarah looked at the video footage again. Barbara Wilson had thought she was clever, but she hadn't counted on modern technology. The camera had caught what human eyes had missed. In her office, Sarah started writing her report. This wasn't just about one false arrest anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of racism and false accusations that have been going on for too long. The next step would be arresting Barbara Wilson, but Sarah knew the real work was just beginning. They needed to find all their victims, clear their records, and make sure this couldn't happen to anyone else. Marcus hung up the phone, wiping tears from his eyes. "Jasmine's okay," he said. "She never doubted I was innocent." Sarah smiled. "Smart girl. Now, Mr. Johnson, let's work on making sure this never happens to another driver again." Barbara Wilson was enjoying her afternoon tea when she heard the knock at her door. She set down her porcelain cup carefully, smoothed her skirt, and walked to answer it. The confident smile on her face disappeared when she saw Detective Sarah Chen standing there, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Mrs. Wilson," Detective Chen said firmly, holding up her badge, "we need to talk about your taxi ride this morning." Barbara's hand trembled slightly against the doorframe, but she kept her voice steady. "Oh, was there some problem with my fare?" "You could say that," Sarah replied, stepping forward. "We have a warrant to search your home, and we need you to come down to the station with us." Barbara's perfect world started crumbling around her as the officers entered her house. She watched helplessly as they went straight to her kitchen, to the exact drawer where she kept her supplies. One officer pulled on latex gloves and carefully bagged everything as evidence. But how?" Barbara stammered, her grandmother act slipping away. "There weren't any cameras. I checked. I always check." Sarah smiled grimly. "You missed the new dashboard camera, Mrs. Wilson. Technology can be tricky that way, especially when you're not familiar with the latest models." In her living room, another officer was checking Barbara's computer. "Detective," he called out, "you're going to want to see this." On the screen was an email chain from a private group called Neighborhood Watch Alliance. The messages discussed targeting specific drivers, sharing techniques for planting evidence, and coordinating false reports. Barbara's username appeared in many of the conversations. "How many?" Sarah asked, turning to Barbara. "How many drivers have you and your friends falsely accused?" Barbara's face hardened. Her sweet elderly lady mask completely disappeared, revealing the cold person beneath. "I was protecting our neighborhood," she said sharply. "Those people don't belong here." "Those people?" Sarah repeated, her voice firm. "You mean hard-working people like Marcus Johnson? A single father working to send his daughter to college? Or Michael Torres, who was supporting his sick mother? Or James Washington, who lost his house because of your false accusation?" Each name made Barbara flinch slightly, but she kept her chin up. "I did what I had to do." As the officers led Barbara out to their car, neighbors began gathering on their lawns. They watched in shock as their respected community member, the retired schoolteacher who organized bake sales and garden clubs, was led away in handcuffs. Mrs. Henderson, Barbara's next-door neighbor, rushed over to Detective Chen. "There must be some mistake," she insisted. "Barbara is a pillar of our community." Sarah showed Mrs. Henderson the tablet she was holding, playing the dashboard camera footage. "Is this the kind of person you consider a pillar of the community? Someone who plants drugs on innocent people because of their race?" Mrs. Henderson's face paled as she watched the video. Other neighbors gathered around, their expressions changing from confusion to horror as they realized what their friendly neighbor had been doing. At the police station, Barbara sat in the same interview room where Marcus had been held earlier that day. But unlike Marcus, she couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Her perfectly arranged hair was becoming disheveled, and her expensive clothes couldn't hide her nervous fidgeting. "We've contacted police departments in 3 counties," Sarah explained, laying out photos of different drivers. "All these men were arrested because of anonymous tips that matched your pattern. All of them lost their jobs. Some lost their homes. One lost custody of his children." Barbara stared at the photos, but said nothing. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued. "We're charging you with filing false reports, possession with intent to distribute, and civil rights violations. Your friends from the online group are being arrested as we speak, and every single driver you've hurt is going to get justice." Outside the interview room, Marcus watched through the one-way glass. Seeing Barbara now, small and scared in the harsh fluorescent light, it was hard to believe she had caused so much pain to so many families. "You okay?" Sarah asked, stepping out to join him. Marcus nodded slowly. "I just keep thinking, if it wasn't for that camera, I'd be the one sitting in there right now. How many others weren't as lucky as me?" Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. "That's why we're not stopping until we find all of them. Every single case, every driver. This ends now." News of Barbara Wilson's arrest spread through the city like wildfire. Local TV stations camped outside the police station, their cameras focused on the entrance. Inside, Detective Sarah Chen's office had turned into a busy command center, with officers coming and going as more victims were identified. James Washington sat across from Sarah's desk, his hands shaking as he looked at old case files. 2 years ago, he had lost everything after Barbara accused him of dealing drugs from his taxi. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke. "I lost my house," he said quietly. "My wife left me. My kids, they wouldn't even talk to me. Everyone thought I was a drug dealer." He looked up at Sarah with tears in his eyes. "Can you really clear my name?" "We already have the paperwork started," Sarah assured him. She pulled out a folder containing his case file. "Barbara Wilson's confession covers your case. By next week, your record will be clean." In another room, Marcus Johnson was helping other officers identify more victims from Barbara's online group messages. His knowledge of the taxi community was proving invaluable. "That's Ron Miller," he said, pointing at a photo. "He used to drive the night shift. After they arrested him, his daughter had to drop out of college. Nobody's heard from him since." Officer Rodriguez made another note. "That makes 23 drivers so far, all arrested on false charges, all minorities." The investigation was growing bigger than anyone had expected. Barbara's online group had members in 5 different cities. They had been organizing these false accusations for years, targeting not just taxi drivers but also delivery workers and repair technicians. Sarah's phone rang. It was the district attorney's office. "We're upgrading the charges," the DA informed her. "This is now a federal civil rights case. The FBI is sending a team to help coordinate across state lines." Meanwhile, in the county jail, Barbara Wilson was learning what life was like on the other side of the law. Her requests for special treatment due to her age had been denied. She sat in her cell, still wearing her pearl necklace, looking nothing like the powerful person who had ruined so many lives. Back at Metropolitan Taxi Services, changes were already happening. The company had called an emergency meeting with all drivers. The owner, Mr. Thompson, stood before them, looking embarrassed and determined. "We failed you," he admitted to the room full of drivers. "We should have believed you when you said you were innocent. We should have fought harder for you. That changes today." He announced new policies, better cameras in all taxis, legal support for any accused drivers, and a zero-tolerance policy for false accusations. The company would also help contact all former drivers who had been wrongly fired, offering them their jobs back with back pay. Jasmine, Marcus's daughter, sat in the back of the meeting room, holding her father's hand tightly. She had skipped basketball practice to be there. When Mr. Thompson finished speaking, she stood up. "I want to say something," she announced. The room fell silent as the teenage girl walked to the front. "My dad is the best person I know," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He taught me that when bad things happen, you don't just fight for yourself, you fight for everyone who might be next. That's why we can't just fix what happened. We have to make sure it never happens again." The room burst into applause. Several drivers wiped tears from their eyes. Marcus beamed with pride at his daughter's words. Later that evening, Sarah sat at her desk, looking at the growing wall of photos. All the drivers they had identified so far. Each picture represented a life that had been damaged or destroyed by prejudice and false accusations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Found 3 more drivers in the suburbs. Meeting them tomorrow. They're ready to tell their stories." Sarah looked at the mounting evidence, the confessions from Barbara's online friends, and the growing list of victims. This case had started with one observant detective noticing something wrong with a single arrest. Now it was becoming one of the biggest civil rights cases the state had ever seen. She picked up her phone to call Marcus back. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time, real justice seemed possible. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning of Barbara Wilson's trial. The case had caught national attention, with news cameras lined up outside and reporters filling the back rows of the courtroom. Marcus Johnson sat in the front row, surrounded by other drivers who had come to witness justice being served. Barbara looked small and old in her gray prison uniform, so different from the confident woman who had stepped into Marcus's taxi that morning. Her expensive lawyer sat beside her, shuffling through papers nervously. They had already tried to make a plea deal, but the prosecution had refused. District Attorney Maria Santos stood up to make her opening statement. She had been working with Detective Sarah Chen for months, building an airtight case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Maria began, her voice firm and clear. "This case is about more than just one woman planting drugs in a taxi. It's about an organized group of people who deliberately tried to destroy the lives of hardworking men and women simply because of their race." On a large screen, she showed the dashboard camera footage from Marcus's taxi. The courtroom watched in silence as Barbara's careful movements were played in slow motion. Then came the emails, the online group messages, and the long list of victims. 28 drivers, Maria continued. 28 families torn apart. 28 lives nearly destroyed. And all because Mrs. Wilson and her friends decided that certain people didn't belong in their neighborhood. One by one, the victims took the stand. James Washington described losing his family. Ron Miller talked about his daughter dropping out of college. Michael Torres explained how he had almost lost his house while supporting his sick mother. Each story made the jury's expressions grow darker. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he spoke directly to Barbara. "I want you to know about the daughter whose future you almost destroyed," he said. "I want you to understand what you would have taken from her." Jasmine, sitting in the courtroom, wiped tears from her eyes as her father described their dreams for her future and how close they had come to losing everything. Barbara's lawyer tried to paint her as a confused elderly woman who had made a mistake, but then came the evidence from her computer. Years of detailed plans, celebrations when drivers lost their jobs, even tips shared with others about the best ways to plant evidence. Detective Sarah Chen was the final witness for the prosecution. She explained how the investigation had uncovered similar groups in other cities, all targeting minority workers with false accusations. "This wasn't a mistake," Sarah testified. "This was a carefully planned campaign of racism and destruction, and it would have continued if not for one small camera that Mrs. Wilson didn't notice." During a break in the trial, Marcus stood outside the courthouse with other drivers. News reporters wanted to interview them, but they were more interested in talking to each other, sharing stories, and supporting one another. "Whatever happens in there," Marcus said to the group, "we've already won something important. We stood up together. We proved our innocence, and we made sure this can't happen to anyone else." Back in the courtroom, Barbara finally took the stand. Under questioning, her gentle grandmother act crumbled completely. She became angry, her true feelings showing through. "Those people were ruining our neighborhood," she snapped, forgetting her lawyer's careful coaching. Somebody had to do something. Those people? Maria Santos repeated. You mean hardworking Americans trying to support their families? The jury took only 3 hours to reach their verdict. As the forewoman stood up, the courtroom fell silent. Marcus grabbed Jasmine's hand. Detective Chen leaned forward in her seat. On the charge of filing false police reports, we find the defendant guilty, the forewoman read. On the charge of possession with intent to distribute, guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, guilty. Barbara's face turned pale as the judge announced her sentence. 15 years in federal prison. At her age, it was basically a life sentence. As the court officers led Barbara away, she looked one last time at the crowd of drivers and their families. But instead of seeing anger, she saw something that seemed to disturb her even more. They were smiling, hugging each other, celebrating not her punishment, but their vindication. Outside the courthouse, justice had finally been served, but its impact was just beginning to spread across the country. 1 year after Barbara Wilson's conviction, Marcus Johnson stood at a podium in front of City Hall. Behind him sat the mayor, Detective Sarah Chen, and representatives from taxi companies across the state. A large crowd filled the plaza, including many familiar faces from the trial. Today, we're here to celebrate the signing of the Driver Protection Act, Marcus announced into the microphone. The crowd cheered. In the front row, Jasmine beamed with pride at her father, now the president of the newly formed Drivers' Rights Association. The law they were celebrating would require all taxis and rideshare vehicles to have multiple security cameras. It also created strict penalties for false accusations and established a legal defense fund for wrongly accused drivers. They were calling it Marcus's Law in the media, though Marcus kept insisting the credit belonged to everyone who had fought for justice. Detective Sarah Chen watched from her seat on the stage, thinking about how much had changed in 1 year. After Barbara's conviction, similar cases had been discovered across the country. The FBI had uncovered dozens of online groups like Barbara's, leading to more arrests and convictions. James Washington, who had lost everything to a false accusation, was now running the Legal Defense Fund. His family had reunited after his name was cleared, and his children were in the crowd today, wearing T-shirts that said, "Justice drives forward." Ron Miller's daughter had returned to college, her tuition paid by a settlement from Barbara Wilson's estate. She was studying criminal justice, inspired by Detective Chen's work on the case. This law isn't just about cameras and penalties, Marcus continued his speech. It's about saying that every person deserves to work without fear. It's about standing together against prejudice and lies. In the county jail, Barbara Wilson sat in her cell, watching the ceremony on a small TV. She looked much older now, her gray hair no longer perfectly styled. The other inmates had no sympathy for someone who had tried to destroy innocent people's lives. Back at City Hall, Mr. Thompson from Metropolitan Taxi Services took the podium. His company had undergone major changes since the case. They had hired many of the wrongly accused drivers back, with full back pay. Every taxi now had multiple cameras, and dispatchers were trained to spot suspicious calls. We got it wrong before, Mr. Thompson admitted to the crowd. But thanks to Marcus, Detective Chen, and all the brave drivers who spoke up, we have a chance to make it right. After the ceremony, Marcus returned to his taxi. He kept driving, despite offers of other jobs. "This is my profession," he would say. "I'm proud of it." But now his taxi had 4 cameras, a panic button, and direct access to police dispatch. Jasmine, now 16, sat in the front seat with him as he started his shift. She still came along sometimes, proud to see how passengers treated her father with respect. The story of his fight for justice had made him something of a local hero. "Dad," she said, looking at the new law book sitting on the dashboard. "Remember when you told me that bad things can either break you or make you stronger?" Marcus nodded, thinking about that terrible day when he'd been arrested, and how it had led to unexpected changes. "We got stronger, didn't we?" Jasmine asked. "All of us." "We did," Marcus agreed, "but more importantly, we made things better for others." Across the city, other drivers were starting their shifts too. Each one had a copy of the new law, cameras watching out for them, and the knowledge that they weren't alone anymore. Detective Sarah Chen sat at her desk, looking at the wall where the victims' photos had once hung. Now it displayed newspaper clippings about the law's passage and pictures from celebration rallies. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. First shift under the new law. Thank you for believing in us. As the sun set over the city, Marcus drove his regular route, picking up passengers from all walks of life. Each fare was recorded by multiple cameras, each ride protected by new laws and awareness. The fear was gone, replaced by pride and security. The story of Barbara Wilson's hatred and lies had transformed into something unexpected, a story of justice, unity, and positive change. As Marcus often told new drivers, sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best changes for everyone.